Thank you for joining us. This is Our Revolution Washington Bernie-Kratz Coalition vetting interview of Maralyn Chase, running for state senate in the 32nd Legislative District of Washington. Thank you for joining us today, Senator Chase. We don't usually get someone with a title already, so if I slip into your first name, please forgive. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your district?
Sure. I'm serving in the Senate. I've been in the legislature for 16 years. I served 8 years in the House, and I moved to the Senate in 2010. I am the current chair of the Economic Development and International Trade Committee. I have an agenda that that you would like. It's a good agenda. I've been interested in politics since I was in the 7th grade. And I think I was 10 years old, and I wanted to run for student body president, and I was told I couldn't because it should be a boy. And yes, I'm not serious. And since then, I've always been interested in leadership and power and how you get people to do what you want them to do, something they might not ordinarily do, and democracy. I'm a big fan of democracy, and I think it's really important. I think our democracy is in peril, and I think every single one of us, it's time for Americans to come together.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any unique aspects to the 32nd LD?
Oh, yes. We are two. We have parts of Seattle, all of Shoreline, and that's King County. In Snohomish County, we have Edmonds, Linwood, Montlake Terrace, Woodway. That's it. I've got five or six cities, little small cities. It's the manufacturing hub of the state, but we also have rural areas that do not have broadband. We have several Indian tribes. We have what I think, we don't have the final numbers out yet, but we have the first people of color majority city in the county in Linwood, and we're seeing tremendous changes, and it's hard on some people to see change, but it's happening. That's great. It's a great district.
Excellent.
We go from the mountains, by the way. We go from volcanoes up in the mountains down to the Puget Sound and the Salish. Yeah, it's really a lovely district.
Thank you so much for joining us, and it sounds lovely. And Rhonda likes to start off with a couple of anti-corruption questions. Sure. So prepare yourself.
Yes, I do. Before I get there, though, I am curious on what are some of the most proud moments of your service to our state? Your proud moments during your legislature career.
When I take a vote, I feel very proud and very privileged. We're working on public policy that's really important, and it means a lot for students' lives. And I'll tell you a couple that I still think about them. Last session, there were a lot of students who were not going to get to graduate from high school because they couldn't pass a biology test. And they were being tested on things they really they hadn't studied. Some people just can't take tests like that. And it was just sprung on them. It was not a fair situation. And so we were able to figure out a way to help those students graduate. Graduation from high school is very important in our economy because you can't get a job without that very basic credential. You just have to have it. And coupled with their difficulty with a biology test, there was another situation at the same time. They were not allowed to take the GED test, which a lot of people take. We used to have about 14,000 students a year. This is the second thing I'm proud about, who take the biology test or to take the GED test. And in 2014, the legislature changed that GED test so that only about 5,000 students could pass it. Now, these are not students who are going to go to college. These are students who want to get the credential so they can go to work. But when the test was changed, it was changed from a high school completion test to a college entrance test, and that was not their career path. And it was simply tragic. We had by the time we got this changed in the law last year, we had about 30,000 people who attempted to take that test and couldn't pass it. You know, it was criminal what we were doing to people who who wanted to go to work. You know, that's why they want to take a GED test. And so we were able to change it. It was a big struggle. I had a lot of people against me on that, a lot, getting up to the vote. And then we got a unanimous vote out of the Senate, and we got, I think, pretty much a unanimous vote out of the House. And so we got that. It was good. So
Wow.
I'm very proud of that because, you know, it makes a difference in people's lives, and
It does.
opens up the future for them. And if I weren't there, you know, it would not be changed.
Well, thank you for that, Maralyn. That's wonderful to hear. I love that story. So thank you for updating that. So I do go into more of an anti-corruption kind of piece at the beginning. I'm with Represent Us. It's a national organization. We work on passing the American Anti-Corruption Act. So it's a lot of pieces put together in it, but it's about anti-corruption. It's about accountability. It's about transparency in government, election reform, and all that good stuff. So part of it, of course, I'm going to say, please go take a look, and I'll send you some information on it. But it's we work at a local level on up to a national kind of aspect. You know, we believe in, you know, building up to it. So a lot of it, what I like to look at is election reform, because as we are here right now, especially in Washington State, we have the top two. So sometimes it feels limiting to us, to some people that might be more independent minded, or, you know. So we're looking at, and we really are behind ranked choice voting, and or a scored voting system, which will help open up who people can vote for. So some people won't vote for somebody they really want right now because they just don't know that they're not sure that they could really make it past. So they just go with who they think is safe. This gives an opportunity for people to vote for who they really want as their first. And then, okay, this is who I'll be happy, you know, be okay with if they make it on down. Have you heard much about it? And if so, what are your thoughts about?
I first heard about this proposal at a League of Women Voters meeting.
I'm a member.
Oh, okay. All right. And so we had, this may sound silly, but it was demonstrating with ice cream cones, you know.
We've done cookies before. I love these.
You know, it demonstrated how we can actually, I think, have an expansion of democracy, because I believe we're in a situation of a democracy deficit in all across the board, and we can talk about that later. But this is a proposal that I think, you know, merits a greater in-depth study, and I think it is so different that most people would say, well, I don't think I want that, you know, I don't understand it, which that's why I like to talk about the ice cream cones. I could talk about chocolate chip cookies, I suppose, but you know, I think we need to look at it, you know, and until I fully understand it, I don't want to say I would vote for it or against it, but as you can tell, I've been looking at it a little bit, and not enough. And we certainly haven't gotten it to the floor yet, or to a hearing. I was particularly proud of Sam Hunt and his committee this last year. We did a lot of good election reform.
Yes, you did. Oh my gosh, Washington came out brilliant in that.
Was it something? You know, you just think we had 5 years of pent up, you know, desire for bills, and everybody had a big stack of bills that we all wanted to pass, but couldn't pass everything. But Sam got to the, and I think that goes a long way towards addressing the democracy deficit, but still more that we need to do. So anyway, it was good. But so yes, I know the bill you're referring to, or the proposal you're referring to. I don't know that we have had a bill yet on it.
No, not yet, but we're working on it at some local levels, like in Seattle and some other places, and kind of moving on up to get some good data
Sure.
to be able to bring up to the state. So it's out there and being worked on. So I just want to get your opinion and see if you're open to the idea of bringing it out.
So. Before I say no to something, I always dig in. I'm a person that drills down pretty deeply on policy issues, and I think that has merit. We should look at it.
Beautiful. And then money in politics, as we know, it can be pretty damaging. So what are your thoughts on that, and how ways that we can look at trying to change that? Are you open to publicly funded elections with like a set?
I think it's the only way to go. I think that let me just say that I do not like Citizens United. I think we need to get corporations and we need to get PACs out of our election financing. A lot of people say, well, people could just then go individually. Rich people could just go ahead and give a lot of money. Well, they do that now. And so what has happened is that money is more a determinant in our democracy than people's votes. And the only way that I know to get around that, and I'm pretty firm on this, is public financing of our elections. Because we're not about, money talks and the rest of us take a walk. We are supposed to be able to participate in the decisions that matter to us and our families and our communities, and in how we operate. And if you can't get elected unless you represent the multimillionaire or billionaire class, something's really wrong. So I think we need to work on this, as a very high priority.
Oh, thank you. I love that answer. And part of that is really increasing transparency so we can see where money, all that stuff. And then also how our government's working and what they're voting on. What are some suggestions, do you think, to help increase our transparency?
Well, I work on this issue too. So you might as well hear all of it.
Please.
So we hear a lot about transparency in government. And we want to have full transparency. This last session, people want to get into the files and see everything that's in there, and under, say, freedom of the press. But I look at that and say, well, we have laws protecting our citizens' privacy and their confidentiality. We need to talk about those laws. We have in government, for example, in the Department of Revenue, we have all of these tax exemptions. We're up to 700, over 600, just in the Department of Revenue. And we give the people's money away every time we give a tax exemption. And we have the right, I think, and the voters have the right to expect, what are we paying for? Because what we're doing is we are allocating the budget and administering it through the Department of Revenue. That's what happens when you get a tax exemption, because we're spending the people's money to hopefully do something that we want to have happen with public policy. And if that were all it would be, that would be good. I wouldn't have a problem if we had a way to incentivize people, to do something that we needed to have done. But that's not what's happening. We don't know what they're doing with the money. We don't have accountability. So if you don't have transparency, you can't have accountability. And even more serious than the transparency and the accountability, the Department of Revenue has done a study on tax exemptions, and you can take a look at it. It's I don't know if I have it's 2016 tax exemption study, and it's a big 600 page. Or over 600 pages, but each exemption gets a page. So you want to know what's going on the tax exemption, you take a look, and you will see that oftentimes the legislature gave a tax exemption for no reason listed. They just gave them the money. There was nothing that they were supposed to do. And so we have all of these tax exemptions. So some of them are state tax exemptions and some are local tax exemptions. People forget that there are local tax exemptions too. And so the exemptions are usually like property tax, B&O tax, sales tax, and other taxes. So the state gives about $54 billion in tax exemptions, but the local governments give 58 billion, 58.5. So you look at that and you say, we have more in tax exemptions than we have in the general fund for running the state. And if you have that many tax exemptions, what would happen if you were to repeal those tax exemptions and put it to funding schools, for example? We did not fulfill, in my opinion, our responsibility for McCleary. We have our like in Seattle or in King County and Snohomish County, we're less money. My daughter's on the school board here in Snohomish County, and they're dealing with a $49 million reduction in the money that they have to operate the schools. And that means teachers don't get professional salaries. The students do not get the kinds of resources they need, in the schools. And so we have large class sizes. We know that we need smaller class sizes. We're not getting it. So the whole idea of bringing about transparency and accountability in government means you have to understand where these little places are, where they're stashing, where the money is being stashed. And one is the Department of Revenue. And if you take a look at that book, I urge you. I mean, I could talk for hours on this issue, but
I will, because thank you for that, because I didn't know that.
Oh yeah.
So this is good info and some stuff for us to really dig into.
Oh yeah, they don't want you to know about it.
Thank you for sharing that. So I appreciate your answers. Like I said, these are really near and dear to all of our group. I mean, that's really the basis of where we're at, as we're trying to make a more, people-powered government, transparency. So our next section that we kind of do is we have a list that the group kind of came up with, and Courtney kind of heads that up. So I'm going to pass the torch on to Courtney for this part. Go ahead, Courtney.
Thank you very much. As Rhonda said, our group put this list together, and it's basically a list of services that we're asking, do you think this should be a public service, a publicly funded service, or a privately funded service? And then some people choose to answer a combination of, and that sort of thing. So we'll dive in. Do you think healthcare should be a publicly funded service?
Of course. I believe in single payer. I believe in Medicare for all. So I've introduced legislation to that. And there's a group that had Washington Watch, I think it is, and doing a lot of good work around that issue. So we would go out do one time I did a PowerPoint. I talked about single payer, and she talked about the policy that we were pushing. It was all very good.
Excellent. Okay, and postal service.
Well, the Postal Service is an interesting issue. It's a federal issue, so we don't have a whole lot of power. I think the Postal Service, they're the only agency in federal government that's had to pay forward on all of their pensions and all of that. But the Postal Service was started by Thomas Jefferson, and the United States funded that, subsidized the Postal Service, and practically had magazines and newspapers delivered freely, because Jefferson believed in an educated, informed public as the best defense against tyranny. So in order to get information to them, you had to get the material to them. So he had the post office do that. Over the years, it's changed. The post office is faced with a situation where people don't write letters anymore. So they and that used to be the bulk of the postal mail that was carried. So they have to figure out, what are they going to do for a revenue source? And I'm not quite sure they've figured that out yet. They may end up delivering for a company, doing outside contracting themselves. yeah, they certainly still do deliver a lot of magazines. They deliver some, they could, I mean, they're looking at a lot of sources,
Yeah.
of revenue to make
I
up
heard,
for the loss of, but I think, by and large, I think what you're trying to get at is, should we privatize the government? And because when we privatize services that the government has been providing, there are controls and protections of people's privacy and confidentiality, that are not necessarily amenable to becoming profit centers. And when we privatize, look at children, for example, foster care. When we privatized foster care, we made children into profit centers. They lost their confidentiality and their right to privacy, what I call the cloak of privacy and confidentiality. Because I serve on the Sunshine Committee, which I'd like to talk about, but the idea that citizens, no matter who they are, lose their confidential protections or their constitutional protections to privacy, I take very seriously. There's that issue, plus the idea of, do we have any democratic say over privatized services? Are they transparent? Are they accountable? No. And I think we need to take a harder look at whether we want to be about the business of dismantling the levels of government, whether it's the post office or the federal government or the state government or whatever. We need to look at that and assess what's the damage to our democracy when we do that. And so with all respect for the post office, I understand what they're up against. They essentially have been told you're self-sufficient, so go figure it out. And I don't think they were treated correctly. I mean, I love the post office. I put in a big thing for them every year on their food drive. They keep the food banks are supplied through their food bank program. And they do that just because it's the right thing to do. They probably wouldn't be able to do that if they were privatized. So it's a very complex issue, very complex problem, particularly when we don't have enough revenue to run the government. And we don't have enough revenue to run the government because we can't get tax reform, so far anyway.
and you're right. This list is about what seeing where a candidate or is interested in privatization or versus keeping something or making something public or AKA socializing. And I did hear another idea to help the postal services doing banking services, basic banking in their
It's a great idea. I think that whatever would work for them, to keep it. I would like to see, for example, we don't have broadband across the entire state. We've got massive areas that don't have broadband, but we have post office. So why couldn't the post office get into the broadband delivery service? Just an idea.
Oh my gosh, I love that. You were the first one to bring anything like that up, and it's brilliant. Okay, sorry, go ahead. I just
That's the first time I've ever heard that as well. And I just got it. That's a beautiful, beautiful idea. And I'm going to look into that. Thank you.
So, and foster care is lower on the list. And you said, so we do address it, but you've already answered it. So when we get to that, I'll just move past it. And so the next on our list are schools. Should we keep those publicly funded? Should we move to a charter school system, that kind of thing?
So I am one of the most passionate defenders of public education in the legislature. I believe in public education. I am opposed to privatizing. I am opposed to charter schools. If parents want to have an alternative learning experience for their children, they can start a school within the public schools. We've got a beautiful one here in my district. In a school, it's really amazing. Alternative learning experiences. We do not need charter schools. Charter schools, you have no oversight. You take the public's tax dollars and you lose your oversight. And I talked to some of the people who were running the charter schools, and they make about $100,000 in profit off of each school. That's their business model. And I don't agree with that. I think that, you know, it is a service. It's a public service. Now, I can see, for example, contracting out to a construction company to do roads and bridges, because I don't necessarily think that that's the expertise that we would have for delivering services. You know, I'd make a distinction between commodities and services, and education is a service. Foster kids are a service. Taking care of elderly, that's a service. But building bridges, you need engineers and you need, you know, specialty construction professions. I can see contracting those things out. With all due respect to the Corps of Engineers and what they do, I don't, you know, but so I'm not totally opposed to government contracting and procurement, but there's a distinction in that, because when you do government contracting, you have what is known as general conditions that everybody has to follow. These are the rules that we have. And then you have specifications and plans for the projects. So you contract out to a private entity to build a project, whatever it is, according to the general specifications and the plans. And you deliver it within budget and on time. So there's accountability, there's inspection. But when you do services, for example, you have vulnerable elderly or anybody vulnerable, you need to have pretty close watch on their and oversight on the services that are delivered and how they are treated, because they cannot defend themselves. And for that, I believe we need to have government control. So
I love that delineation between services and what commodity?
Yeah, commodities and products, and it's government procurement, you know.
Yeah.
It's very important.
Much like foster care it should be publicly funded but provided by people, because we don't want to warehouse children.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think that you can have foster parents. We need to do a lot of work in supporting foster parents and inspection and background checks and all of that. But they then could become public employees with oversight, and control. But the idea of putting vulnerable people into control of other people with no oversight or little oversight, they might get a visit every once a month, once a year. No, I just don't think that's not good.
Excellent. So prisons, private prisons.
Oh, don't even get me started.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, okay.
That's all you have to say.
I am totally 100% opposed to this privatization of prisons. It's become an industry. People are abused. I get it that we need some prisons. I get that. But we need fairness and we need transparency. And it makes no sense to have private people in there with no oversight for fairness. You don't give up all your constitutional rights when you are a prisoner. And even if you don't want to put it in terms of constitutional rights, you want to have it at least in terms of what I call the social contract for how we treat each other. It doesn't matter if you are a criminal, you still have the right to let's say the golden rule. You're there in custody, but you're not there to be beaten and to be abused. That's not part of your sentence. And there's that takes a lot of oversight and supervision by people under the cover of law who have the ability to stop that stuff. And you don't have that when you have private prisons. I don't know what we're thinking about as a society when we give the rights of citizens over to private operations to become profit centers. That's not the intent for government action, or for using the power of the government that's one of the reasons why I think we have a democracy. So anyway, I could care. I won't bore you anymore about on that issue, but I'm very, very conscious of it.
It's not boring. I have an incarcerated parent and uncle.
Oh, okay. So you know
we're
what I'm
good.
talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking
And I have
about.
I've said on multiple occasions, while my parent deserves to be in prison, the sentencing didn't include abuse.
That's right. That's right. And it's happening. It's not that we don't know that abuse is going on, because we know it. And the
Absolutely.
other thing, we have so many people who have mental instability, who should not be in prison. They need to be in treatment, but we don't have enough money to pay for the treatment. So you say, why don't we have enough money to pay for the treatment? But that's another question.
Yeah, that's coming. Now, and as you pointed out with Postal Service, it's not within your purview, but so there are going to be things on this list that aren't really within your purview, but it gives us an idea of who you are and where you stand.
Sure.
So the next one is the distribution and investment of Social Security. There's been discussion of privatizing that. And so we would. Thank you.
That is let me just say this, okay. Social Security is an insurance policy. We pay in, it's an insurance policy. And we should when we get ready to retire, I do not intend to retire, but you know, if you're going to retire, that money should be there. It's not supposed to be taken for any other thing. And I happen to remember when President Johnson put the Social Security Fund in with the National General Fund to hide the cost of the war. So it looked like we had more money there than we really have. And I think we should separate Social Security from the general fund and keep it sacred. It is just about the only retirement that the majority of Americans have. And to privatize it or risk it in a stock market crash, no.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We usually go to foster care from there, but we've already addressed that one. So we'll go to child care. Do you feel that there should be a universal child care offer, or keep it private as it is?
No, I think we need to ensure the quality, and that means I think we need private or publicly funded and organized and supervised care in conjunction with the local communities. You know, I mean, local communities may have some things that they prefer that may not be on the same level as what other people prefer, but it needs to have high standards. It needs to be the best thing that we can possibly make for our children. And we know children learn from 1 to 3. We know that they need the best we can possibly provide. And you know, quite frankly, wealthy people in our society have access to that. Low-income people do not. And we need to have it publicly funded and provided, not just, you know, and really, really do it all over the entire country, just like public education. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. So the next one, I'm in Tacoma, and we have public utilities. So trash, recycling, electricity, water. We even have public internet. And so what we don't have is public cell service. But all of those things, utilities with the water, internet, cell service, where do those things land on your publicly funded versus privatized?
I am a believer in public funding of infrastructure and utilities. You know, in 1912, the Grange was instrumental in setting up the PUDs, public utility districts, so we could have more public ownership and control and provision of the utilities. We were in the same situation in Eastern Washington when electricity came in from 1912 to about 1930. And the only way that it was finally provided in rural areas was by the Grange and the PUDs. And finally, there were a couple of private utilities, investor-owned utilities, that were getting some of the service to the rural areas. But unless the government acts, we're going to have a situation continue with broadband. For example, I think broadband is a utility, it's infrastructure. Our economy runs on the internet. And every single person in this state needs to have access and ability. People are not so concerned with IQ anymore. They're concerned with your digital information, your digital DQ. Can you work with digitized economy? Because that's where we're going. And can you move around in different situations with new digital information? That's your sort of your intelligence about digital work. And we have in this state great areas where there's no internet service, and that means no access, no training. We are raising a whole generation of children who are not going to be qualified to get a job. That should be changed. And I believe that is a public responsibility.
Lovely. Thank you. We next have public lands and natural resources. So keep the public lands public. And how do you feel about natural resources being privatized?
I do not believe they should be privatized. I think we should protect them. I'm very concerned about the water. I just, what we saw at Standing Rock, I think we're going to see more here. We certainly had our trials with Hearst. While we had kind of a peace mediation, I don't think we've solved the problem of water. There are too many of the natural, the things that we need for life in the natural resources in land that only can be protected by government. I get heartsick when I see another monument that the president wants to put back into drilling of oil. That makes no sense when we know that climate change is here. It's caused by humans. It's caused by carbon. So why are we drilling more oil? It makes no sense. Fracking. My daughter, as soon as her son graduated from high school and the next day got on the airplane to go fishing up in Sitka, decided she had an empty nest, so she got a really cheap $6 flight to Hawaii by selling the miles off of the credit cards, and went over to the island where the volcano is. That's part of our natural resources. Those are all things we've got to take a look at. I forget what I was going to tell you about that, but it's all natural resources. We need to guard them. We need to guard them.
Excellent.
Land. I see. No, you will see it. Let me just say one more thing about land. You're going to hear a lot about surplus land, and that we should take the surplus land and build houses. Now, I'm in a big favor. I'm all in favor of building houses, and providing public housing. Like Singapore, they don't have a housing problem because they have a Department of Housing. That's what we need, is a Department of Housing. But I forget where I was going to go. I guess to take off.
Well, I say community housing is lower on the list, and I call this efficient politicking. In that your answers, it's almost like you understand all of this is connected.
I do. I do. It's all very important.
Yes.
I know what I was going to tell you about the lands. Okay, so you have the Department of Natural Resources owns parcels of land. Just for what reason? You say, why is that? Why do we own that? Why do we own that? They're scattered. But in the 1930s, there was a huge depression in this state, particularly in agriculture areas. And the farmers had 5 years to pay their taxes. If they couldn't pay their taxes, the state would foreclose on them and take control of their farm. So they lost the farm. And my family was lucky in that we didn't lose the farm, but because my dad and my uncles quit school to work to make the tax payments, so they didn't lose the farm. But a lot of people did. And so we have a lot of property that's scattered around. And it's possible that some of that property, public property now, could be put back into housing. It's possible. But I would want to look at it very carefully. That's a possibility for increase in our housing stock. But out in the forests and in the wilder areas outside the metropolitan areas, oh, I think we need our land, our public land, with everything we can. You know, I don't have a problem leasing public lands. You know, you can lease public lands, but I don't think we should give up ownership of the ground, because you can always break the lease.
There you go.
It's more difficult.
Thank you.
Huh?
And then I think you might have touched on this already. Banks, did you say something about supporting a state bank?
I started to, and then I thought, well, I better wait.
We'll get there.
All right, I support a state bank. Bob Hasagawa is the prime sponsor. I've usually been the second on that. I believe in a public bank because, just to give you an example, I'll tell you several reasons why, but to go back to what we were talking about on property, do you know there was a public bank in North Dakota, and they refused to foreclose on the farmers who couldn't pay their taxes? So they didn't have any property tax foreclosures. So they don't have these scattered sites of ownership. And that's one thing that a public bank could do. You know, we pay right now, we have so much money that we pay in debt service to Wall Street. And we've moved from, just to use the Public Works Trust Fund as an example, we had about $800 million built up in this revolving loan fund from 1986. And we used that money to loan out to municipalities to build the kinds of things they needed to have. When we ran into the economic crisis of 2008, instead of raising taxes, we swept the Public Works Trust Fund and went into a form, you know, to pay for the things. When you hear we put all that money into McCleary, yeah, we took it out of the Public Works Trust Fund and other pots of money that had been allocated for certain public policy priorities. And so when you take the money, when you don't have enough money and say you have an emergency for a new sewer system or water system or whatever, you use what is called debt financing. They issue bonds, buy them from the bank, the Wall Street banks, and then you have to do debt service. We're sending about anywhere from 2.2 to 2.5 billion dollars a year for debt service on these bonds. Why shouldn't we keep that money at home? And that's just one thing the public bank could do, our state bank could do. You know, we are not required to use Wall Street banks. We could easily use our own state bank. The University of Washington runs a state bank. You know, they do their own bonding. You know, they go on the bond market, they buy the bonds, or they sell the bonds, and they get the money to do their construction. They don't go through the Wall Street banks. They're very highly regulated, but they have figured out a way to avoid that debt service. We could do the same thing with the public sector.
Excellent. Thank you. And then Matt.
One more thing. Okay. On the public bank. And I'm using North Dakota as an example. They buy back their student loans. Those kids, when they go back to North Dakota, they go to the bank and they say, I want to get rid of my student loans, and they buy that, you know, they will pay off the bank, and the kids still have to, in many cases, pay their loan off, but at 1% or some kind of interest. I mean, the bank understands it's an investment in the future of our children to educate them. It's better to have educated, you know, young generation than not, and rather than hit them with crippling debt. So the bank has, I can find not a single reason to hold back on establishing a state bank.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we move on to mass transit, from buses to ferries, railways, even airways. Would you like to create a public option in the instance of airways, railways? Do you want to keep the buses and the ferries? I mean, even Tacoma, as socialized as we are, private entity is our bus service. Our public buses are not public.
Because I do deep dive on public policy issues. I don't usually take a position until I'm pretty well informed. Sometimes I trust my colleagues, but generally I do a deep dive on sound transit. As an example, I did probably the deepest dive on that proposal of any that I've had in my time in a legislature. Well, not quite, but you know, I'm very disappointed in that we're going to spend to pay back the money we're going to spend, $54 billion. By the time it's paid off in 2070, we will have spent $102 billion because you have all that debt service you're paying to Wall Street. So it's not just 54 billion that we need to worry about. It's 102 billion. And then you say, well, okay, we got people out of their cars. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because if you read the Puget Sound Regional Council traffic studies, you'll see that they said we'll get maybe 9% increase in trips. So that's about 4.5% more people on transit than they had before. So you say, why are we spending all this money if we're not going to get more people than more than a 4% increase in people on transit? And so, you know, you look around the world and there are bus systems that move people very nicely. We could have moved people, all people, for about $4 billion through the Puget Sound corridor, not spending 102 billion. And so you look at that and you just say, well, we're going to put driverless cars. Well, yeah, we're going to put driverless cars out there on I-5 as an example. And that will help with, it could help with climate change, in that if they're electric cars, they won't be, polluting so much from the petroleum. But it's not going to do anything for congestion. And in their reports and everything, they expect, even with all of the money we're going to be spending, they expect congestion on I-5 to remain just about the same. How is that helping us? You know, how is that helping us? But people don't know that. And yet I get complaints from my constituents, and they send me their bills. They're sending me their car tab bills, you know, and they're paying. There's one I just got in from a fellow in Kenmore, what I used to represent, Kenmore, and he said, look at $243 or something like that just for Sound Transit. He said, I'm not even going to get to use it. So there's something not quite right, you know. And I think we need to have a respect for dialogue in this state, where we can have an informed dialogue about these big policy issues, you know, without the gloss, without the talking points. You can't, I don't think you can do responsible public policy unless you get past the talking points and dig down and find out, are you really solving the problem, or are you creating jobs? Yeah, they're going to create some jobs. That's good. But if you take all the money out of the room, what's going to happen with the infrastructure? You know, for every $1 million we spend in infrastructure, we create about 9 jobs. You know, so if you had $400 million going out in infrastructure, that's a lot of jobs. You know, so there are opportunity costs that we have in some areas of our state for building Sound Transit. You know, we need to talk about that, and we haven't. You know,
absolutely. Thank you. And it does. Sorry about that. It does sound like there might be money in the room. So.
Wait, I lost the sound. I lost your sound.
That's because I have a itchy mute finger.
Okay.
The next thing on our list is infrastructure, but you've already addressed that. See, you're just so complete. So I'll move on to the military and its associated industrial complex. You know, Blackwater versus our home team, you know, Fort Lewis McChord. So how are you feeling about the industrial complex and the privatization of our military?
I think people don't know what's going on. You know, President Eisenhower warned us about the dangers of the military industrial complex. And that was back in 58, I think, in his made a final speech. And since then, in our state, the military has now become an economic sector. It has its own person who shepherds the needs of the economic sector. It's become very, very influential. In fact, in some areas, of the state, particularly up around Alt Field, which is up in Whidbey, on Whidbey Island, there are people there who brought to me the complaint that the military is having the veto power over the use of land in our state. And they're very concerned about that. So this is not a rhetorical question on anyone's part to question, you know, and I believe in a strong, safe military. Don't think that I don't, but I do think that it's supposed to be protecting people from outside. It's not supposed to be used inside the country. And I don't quite think that we need to have, and I have not done the deep dive on the military industrial complex as I have on Sound Transit, but it doesn't make sense to me. What my constituents are bringing to me is extremely troubling.
Absolutely. And one of our United States representatives, whose initials are Derek Kilmer, you might want to see what he's doing over in 6 around the Olympic Mountain Forest, and it's not good. He's a.
They want to use it for bombing runs. Last I heard, isn't there something like
growlers? Instead of, he spent $2 million on a study that had already been done on how to reduce their noise. And then the study came out the same way the first one did, which is you can't reduce their noise without reducing their power, and the military is not going to do that. So we in the Olympic forest area need to just deal with it. And his answer was, well, I know the commander on base and I can get them to stop making loud noises over my house when I need it. So, but you know, we keep voting him in. By the way, he has a progressive competitor. So anyway, side note over. But then the Veterans Administration has been threatened with privatization. How do you feel about that?
Well, my first husband was a Navy man and my second husband was a Marine. Both of them availed themselves of the Veterans Hospital. I am appalled that they think they could get better treatment out of the Veterans Hospitals by privatizing and making them into profit centers. Okay, that having been said, I don't think they're very good hospitals. And they're teaching or research hospitals. I think we need to have the very best care for people who go to war for us. And I don't think they're getting that. And I for sure do not believe they'll get it if there is a privatization of them. That's just my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then do you think that there should be public funding for scientific study?
Of what?
Well, in general, currently there is some public funding of scientific study, like at the college and university levels, and then the science that is discovered there is then sold off to be have profits made off of it by private companies. I feel like the clearest example is maybe the pharmaceutical industry. A lot of money is being made off of the science, and it's much like we did the airways of our R's, but it's private industry making a profit off of it. So an increase in scientific funding, somehow making sure that some of that profit comes back to the government because it was scientific, funded by the government, like the internet. And
okay, so let me break this down for you. Okay, there's intellectual property that is created by the study and research that goes on in the universities. And I believe in science. I like that. I really like science. I like the discoveries of science. Okay, the ownership of the public property, the intellectual property, patents and that kind of thing, is what really is at question. And should it be put into the private sector for development, or should it remain in the public sector? The reason that about in early 80s, people were beginning to understand the National Science Foundation had been funding a lot of scientific research, making wonderful discoveries. But what happened is that the discoveries were put on a shelf because there was no one to develop them. We had the information and we couldn't get it to the market. So they came up with this privatization idea. and they're doing their, you know, and they're trying to work the bugs out. But generally speaking, what happens is people get a hold of the intellectual property, but the public gets no compensation for having funded the research. We're not taking an ownership position in that property. And I think we should have an ownership position. This might be a perfect example of why we need, in some cases, new relationships between public and private, so that, okay, we can go ahead and fund the research, but we own a big significant chunk of it, you know, because we created it, we paid for it. We don't have that yet. So I think we have to, we have a right to have that. You know, and by the way, our state constitution prohibits us from giving tax dollars to any private entity of any sort whatsoever. Several places in the Constitution, you will not give public dollars for stocks or bonds or any of that, you know, or companies. It's just forbidden. So they've figured out little workarounds. They'll give something to a nonprofit, you know, and so we have a real issue. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Excellent, thank you. I think you had the clearest answer we've had.
Good.
For such a cloudy question.
I do a lot of work on that.
We should talk to you more, so we can learn. And then, so space exploration, not for Space Force, but more for NASA. Do you support the continuation of NASA?
Oh yeah, I do.
Okay, excellent. And then libraries is on. Oh, did you want to go on with NASA?
No, not NASA. But I was going to say, you know, Blue Origin came to the committee, and I support Blue Origin. I think they're really great. You know, they're going to get civilian aircraft up there, and Jeff Bezos, you know, he liquidated $100 million of Amazon stock to be able to keep Blue Origin operational. And I wouldn't mind having a seat on the first space shuttle. I'd like to go to space. But then he came to my committee and wanted a tax exemption for all of his work. I said, no. I mean, I've got 40,000 little school kids over here who are homeless, who need money. And what are our priorities? Do we give you money when you don't need it? Mm-hmm. Or do we feed children? Do we take care of children? So I'm not very popular in those areas these days. So.
You're popular to us. You found a new place to be popular.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
And then I think you might have touched on libraries, but keep public libraries.
Absolutely.
Tacoma has been losing them.
You know, we've got internet now in the public libraries, and the kids, even if they have internet in their schools, you know, where are they going to do their homework? So they have to go to the libraries. Libraries are serving an infrastructure function, not just books, but places where kids who don't have computers at home, where they can go to do their homework. You know, libraries are very important.
Absolutely. And I think it varies greatly. Like I'm in Tacoma, I'm in a massive urban center, but we just spoke with someone who's from the northeast corner of the state, and their libraries are the only places they have with a meeting room.
That's right. That's right.
So everything happens in the libraries there. So, and then you mentioned community housing, and that's next on our list. And I wonder, are you familiar? I believe Bellingham is putting out, doing something called the Vienna Project, something to do with Vienna has so when a property goes up for sale, Vienna buys it, and then they make it community housing. So then those who don't have a house, those who age out of the houses they're currently in, or accrue a disability that prohibits them from the house they've been in, they can be housed in a house that suits their needs. So I'm not sure. So you spoke in favor of community housing. Would you talk a little more?
Well, I do that. Kelly Linville is the mayor up there. She used to serve with me in the legislature. I am not familiar with this program, but in concept, the way you describe it is something I absolutely think is a good idea.
Excellent. And then
Reason we have unsheltered, we don't have enough places for them to live that
That's-
they can afford.
so then elections, should they be publicly funded?
Yes.
Excellent. We have a severe gap in legal services between public defenders and they don't cover, we're not funding them properly. And then there's a whole slew of non-criminal reasons to go to court, like divorce, what have you, property disputes, where people can't afford legal services, but the legal environment is complicated. And so the average person is being locked out of true justice. Would you, does the idea of expanding legal services appeal to you?
Sure. I think it's a cost-effective way to begin to take a look at providing the kinds of, like, civil, not criminal, but civil issues, you know, to lower the cost. And whatever we can do, I think we have some great, you know, drug courts and traffic courts and small courts that don't cost a lot as much as some of the big trials. I think it's a great way to do it.
Excellent. And then first responders is next on our list. There's some people who don't want their tax money going to public services, but, you know, our cops and our firefighters are. So you want to maintain public service, public kindness. Excellent.
Absolutely.
And then the last one is more of an idea so there's no policy behind it. We've not figured out how to pay for it. So we acknowledge the limitations, but the idea is a caregiver's basic income. So if you're raising a child, say under the age of 8, caring for an elderly aging person or someone with disabilities, a vulnerable people, the person caregiving shouldn't have to juggle a job or jobs while doing that. And often more than one, often we have people raising children and caring for aging family members. So a caregiver's basic income is suggested to aid those people and also go towards a Social Security credit, because right now, if you take time off from work to caregive, you take a beating in your retirement. So how do you feel about that idea?
I think it's a great idea. We need to get this. I'd like to work on that. I think that's a good idea. You know, family support is something that we need better. We need more of in this country, and I think that's a good idea.
Excellent.
Other countries have it, by the way.
There you go.
Oh, that was wonderful. Are you on a time constraint? Because we usually do about an hour. We're a little over, but there's still a couple things I'd like to ask, but I don't want to take away from your day.
Time constraint. Let me just see how much time I have. I have a 3:30 appointment.
Oh, okay, it's 3:08 right now.
Yeah, so I've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, can I want to jump in real quick with some tax, because tax, okay, you know, our tax codes, and it sounds like you might have some good information, but really just basically, how do you see, or how do you think we can improve this tax system in Washington State?
Well, I believe in an income tax. I introduce an income tax every year. It doesn't mean that we're going to get anywhere. So I'm working very hard to educate people on the distribution of income and wealth, how unfair our tax system is, the fact that we're #1 in the most regressive tax structure in the entire United States. I think that once people begin to understand how really unfair our tax system is, that we will be able to get, I think, tax reform. I'm now, my latest tact is to go back to the Grange and show how active they were in working towards income tax. And, you know, we've had tax proposals for an income tax and put intangible tax property back on the tax rolls since 1927. So I could carry on for an hour on this.
Beautiful. I just wanted to see about that, if you're for the income tax, because there's a lot of rebuttal out there. So I'm liking that you are. Yeah. Excellent. Anything from anybody that's really major before we let Maralyn kind of...
We actually had a question from the audience.
Cool.
Heidi Verthaler, I apologize if I messed that up. She asked a question that I'm a former Seattle resident, now living in Southern Maine. Has anyone else asked her about what she would ensure the safety of our environment by stopping the LNG in 253 the Tacoma watershed and Puyallup River. And she says, I know that they say that if a man-made natural disaster were to occur, that it would cause a nuclear bomb-like explosion one many times over. What can we do to stop the company from building this monstrosity?
My money's on the Puyallups. I think it's their land, essentially, and they've taken a very strong stand about this. And I think they have their reasons, that need to be heard. Much like the Lummies were instrumental on Cherry Point, I think Puyallups might be as instrumental in this project. I know that a lot of people want the jobs. And they do create a lot of jobs, but we have to ask ourselves, what about the safety? It used to be a few years back that we would see pictures of tankers with like X's on the back. They're just, sitting time bomb. But a lot of people want to say, well, we need to use this LNG for propelling shipments, tanker shipments up to Alaska and other places like that. By and large, I don't think it's a good idea, but that's because environmental concerns. Oh, sorry about that.
Oh,
okay.
You're good.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's about your time, and thank you for answering that. And sorry we weren't able to get to a little more of the questions and the nitty gritty. But thank you very much for what you do.
I'd be happy to come back again.
We would love that.
Great.
So real quick before we let you go, let's just have you do a quick spiel. Your name, what you're, for re-election, a little quick spiel, where they can find you, how people can help. Go.
Okay, I can. I'm out all over the internet. MaralynChase.com. My name is Maralyn Chase. I'm running for re-election in the 32nd Legislative District. I'm a very progressive Democrat. I work on all of the progressive issues. I'm proudly a Bernie-crat. And I intend to remain a Bernie-crat and, depend on what he's been doing. I think that we need to alert and awaken all of our people in this state and the nation. But my responsibility is this state to what's going on. And that's why I appreciate your question so much today, because I think it was broadly based. But I think people need to know that we are thinking about these issues. And we need to get them on the public agenda. I, of course, will always take anybody's support, financial or endorsements or whatever, because this is a very difficult race. I'm being challenged in a significant fashion. So I'd appreciate your support.
Thank you so much, Maralyn. And thank you all for joining us with Maralyn. And yes, we do plan on speaking with you again. You are brilliant and gave us so much information. We'll let you get going. You've got a busy day. But thank you again so very much.
Thank you.